It took exactly one misspelled word, one glaring typo on a daycare sign that captured everything wrong with what might be the largest fraud scandal in American history. Quality Learing Center, not learning. Learing. And this establishment, which couldn't spell the most basic word in education, had received $4 million in taxpayer money. No children, no classes, no operations, just an empty building with blacked out windows and $4 million missing from state coffers. Welcome to Minnesota, where a 23-year-old YouTuber in a gray hoodie just did what an entire state government, FBI field office, and major media outlets failed to do for years. Expose a $9 billion fraud operation so massive it rivals the entire GDP of Somalia. December 26, 2025. Nick Shirley posted a 42-minute video titled, "I investigated Minnesota's billion-dollar fraud scandal" on YouTube and X. Within 48 hours, it had exploded past 90 million views, making it one of the most watched investigative pieces in social media history. No professional crew, no major network backing, just a young man with a camera phone, a researcher named David, and the audacity to knock on doors and ask simple questions that apparently no one in authority had bothered to ask. Where are the children? What are you doing with taxpayer money? Why is your building empty? The response? Door slams, threats, and in one viral moment that captured the insanity of the entire situation, a white woman screaming at the top of her lungs, "Don't open up! He's ICE! Don't open!" She wasn't warning about immigration enforcement. She was trying to protect what Nick Shirley was about to expose. Empty daycare centers collecting millions in government funds while serving exactly 0 children. Nick Shirley isn't your typical investigative journalist. He's 23 years old, builds his following through street interviews and on-the-ground reporting, and has been amplified by conservative figures like Elon Musk and J.D. Vance. In October 2025, he met with President Trump at the White House to discuss his findings on organized protests. But nothing he'd done before prepared him for what he discovered in Minneapolis. This wasn't political theater. This was systematic theft on a scale that defied comprehension. The investigation began with David, a private researcher who had spent months compiling data on suspicious businesses in Minnesota's social services sector. What started as curiosity about empty daycare centers near his office turned into documentation of over 1,000 potentially fraudulent businesses. More than 800 of them were Somali-owned. David noticed patterns. Non-emergency medical transportation services that never carried passengers. Autism therapy centers that showed no activity. Housing assistance programs billing millions while providing no services. And daycare facilities licensed for dozens or hundreds of children that sat empty during business hours. On December 26th, Nick and David took to the streets of Minneapolis with a simple plan. Visit these locations, ask to enroll children or family members in services, and document what they found. What they captured on camera was jaw-dropping. The Quality Learing Center became the viral symbol of the entire scandal. Licensed for 99 children, receive $0.9 million in fiscal year 2025 alone, with total disbursements approaching $4 million. Nick and David showed up during what should have been peak operating hours. The building looked abandoned. Windows were covered or blacked out. No playground equipment, no children's artwork, no signs of life. When they attempted to film the exterior and ask questions, chaos erupted. A woman, later identified in viral posts as a white progressive activist, began screaming, "Don't open up! He's ICE!" She repeated it over and over, trying to warn whoever was inside that immigration enforcement had arrived. Nick calmly identified himself as a journalist and asked if she supported $1.9 million going to a facility that couldn't spell learning correctly and showed no evidence of serving children. Her response, "Go away. You're not welcome here. Shame on you." The video clip went nuclear on social media. Conservative commentators called it the perfect encapsulation of suicidal empathy. A progressive so committed to protecting perceived victims that she defended obvious fraud, tax theft, and the exploitation of programs meant for vulnerable children. Greg Price tweeted, "If you try to knock on the doors of Somali-owned daycares that have received millions of tax dollars from the Minnesota government, liberal white women will accuse you of being ICE." The tweet received millions of views and tens of thousands of shares. But Nick and David didn't stop at one location. They visited facility after facility throughout Minneapolis and surrounding areas. Creative Minds, Daycare, LLC, shuttered due to violations, immediately reopened the next day as Super Kids Daycare Center, LLC. Same address, different name, money still flowing. Minnesota Child Care Center, Incorporated. No visible activity during business hours. Non-emergency medical transportation services. Fleets of vehicles parked, but never moving. Home healthcare providers. Addresses that led to empty storefronts or residential buildings with no signage. By the end of one day, just one day, Nick and David had documented over $110 million in questionable payments to businesses showing minimal or zero operational activity. The scale became clearer as David explained his research. He had identified approximately 1,000 fraudulent service-oriented businesses, with over 800 owned by Somali immigrants. These weren't isolated incidents. This was an organized ecosystem of fraud that had been operating for years, exploiting nearly every social service program Minnesota offered. Child Care Assistance Program, CCAP, Medicaid, non-emergency medical transportation, autism services, EIDBI, housing stabilization programs, and food assistance through Feeding Our Future. The numbers were staggering. Assistant U.S. Attorney Joe Thompson suggested in December 2025 that the amount of suspected fraud in Minnesota's Medicaid program alone had reached over $9 billion. $9 billion. Nick pointed out in his video that this represented so much fraud it could almost replace the entire GDP of Somalia, which is estimated at $12 billion. The comparison wasn't just clever, it was accurate and damning. A fraud network operating primarily within the Somali American community in Minnesota had stolen nearly as much money as the entire economic output of Somalia. The Feeding Our Future scandal had already resulted in 70-plus federal indictments. That case involved fake nonprofits billing the federal government for meals allegedly served to children during COVID-19. The meals were never prepared. The children didn't exist. The sites were phantom locations. Yet hundreds of millions of dollars flowed through the scheme. Several defendants had already been convicted and received long prison sentences. But even as those prosecutions continued, the broader fraud network kept operating across other programs. The autism services scandal was equally brazen. Companies billed Medicaid for therapy sessions that never occurred. Parents were paid kickbacks of up to $1,500 per month to enroll children who didn't have autism diagnoses. The Housing Stabilization Services Program, meant to help people facing homelessness, saw costs explode from $2.6 million to over $100 million in just a few years before being shut down in October 2025 amid overwhelming evidence of systematic abuse. Federal prosecutors described the situation as fraud tourism. 2 men from Philadelphia were charged after allegedly traveling to Minneapolis, specifically because they'd heard Minnesota's social service programs were a good opportunity to make money. The oversight was so lax, the controls so non-existent that criminals were literally traveling to Minnesota to participate in the theft. How did it get this bad? The trail leads directly to Minnesota Governor Tim Walz's administration. In June 2024, the nonpartisan office of the Legislative Auditor issued a devastating report finding that the Minnesota Department of Education's oversight was inadequate and created opportunities for fraud. State employees who attempted to blow the whistle on suspicious activity faced what they described as systematic retaliation. Multiple whistleblowers reported being fired, demoted, or harassed after raising concerns about fraudulent payments. Court records showed that the state resumed payments to Feeding Our Future, even while suspecting criminal activity. Walz has defended his administration by saying they reported concerns to the FBI. But the timeline raises serious questions. Why did it take years for action? Why were whistleblowers punished instead of protected? Why did payments continue to obvious fraud operations? In a December appearance on NBC's Meet the Press, Walz admitted that Minnesota attracts criminals, but demanded that Somali residents not be demonized. The statement infuriated critics who argued that acknowledging systematic fraud isn't demonization, it's accountability. The political implications are explosive. Representative Ilhan Omar, whose congressional district includes much of the Somali American community in Minneapolis, has faced intense scrutiny. Omar herself hasn't been accused of wrongdoing, but many individuals charged in the fraud schemes come from her district. Federal investigators are examining whether stolen funds were sent overseas, including potential ties to Al-Shabaab, the Somali terror group. The Treasury Department is actively investigating these connections. Omar has dismissed the concerns, arguing that if such connections existed, the FBI should have caught them earlier. Critics respond that her office maintained close relationships with individuals later convicted in the schemes. Nick Shirley's video brought all of this into devastating focus. What had been complex federal prosecutions and bureaucratic reports became a 42-minute visual documentation that anyone could understand. Empty buildings receiving millions, signs with spelling errors, blacked out windows, hostile responses to basic questions, a white progressive screaming, "ICE," to protect fraud. It was government failure and criminal exploitation captured in real time, narrated by a young man with no agenda other than exposing the truth. The response was immediate and massive. House Majority Whip Tom Emmer, who represents Twin Cities suburbs, tweeted, $4 million of hard-earned tax dollars going to an education center that can't even spell learning correctly. Care to explain this one, Tim Walz? FBI Director Kash Patel announced that the Bureau was surging additional personnel and investigative resources to Minnesota, calling the Feeding Our Future case just the tip of a very large iceberg. Patel stated, "The FBI believes this is just the tip of a very large iceberg. Large iceberg. We will continue to follow the money and protect children." The media reaction revealed another scandal, journalistic failure. Minnesota's largest newspaper released its year in review with not a single mention of the fraud consuming the state. National outlets had largely ignored the story until Nick Shirley's video went viral. Conservative commentators pointed out that an independent YouTuber with a hoodie and a camera phone had done more investigative journalism in one day than major media organizations had done in years. The comparison was embarrassing and accurate. By December 28th, the video had surpassed 90 million views across X and YouTube, with numbers still climbing. Elon Musk had shared it. J.D. Vance had amplified it. Conservative media covered it extensively. Even some mainstream outlets were forced to acknowledge the story they'd ignored. Data analysts began mapping the network of suspicious entities, finding additional red flags. 60 active DHS licensed providers, all registered to a single address in St. Paul. Companies closing and reopening under new names at the same locations. Estimated 50,000 national provider identifiers potentially associated with the fraud network. Nick Shirley summed up his findings simply: there's no respect and no fear of American institutions, just a will to steal. The observation cut to the heart of the matter. This wasn't poverty-driven desperation. It was organized, systematic exploitation of governmental systems that lacked oversight, accountability, or the political will to stop it. The fraud had been allowed to balloon to $9 billion because state officials prioritized political considerations over fiscal responsibility, because media outlets failed to investigate, and because anyone who raised concerns was attacked as racist or xenophobic. The Quality Learing Center, with its misspelled sign and $4 million in payments, became the symbol. One building, one typo, one massive failure of government at every level. And it took a 23-year-old with a camera phone to expose it, because everyone else, politicians, bureaucrats, journalists, law enforcement, either didn't care or was too afraid to ask the simple questions. As 2025 ended, the investigations were just beginning. Federal prosecutors promised more indictments. The FBI was following the money trails, including potential connections to overseas terrorism. State legislators were demanding accountability from the Waltz administration. And Nick Shirley was still posting, still investigating, still asking the questions that exposed a fraud network so massive it defied belief. Sometimes, the most powerful investigative journalism comes not from prestigious outlets or experienced reporters, but from a young man in a hoodie, willing to knock on doors and demand answers. And sometimes, a single misspelled word, learing instead of learning, captures everything wrong with government programs that hand out billions without bothering to check if anyone is actually doing the work.